those who are participating via the Internet to Cantini in Wheaton, Illinois. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the Executive Director of the Cantini First Division Foundation and the First Division Museum. I'll say more about this institution later on this afternoon, but you're on the historic estate of Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, combat veteran of the First Division in World War I, 1917 to 1918, came home from the war and named this estate Cantini in honor of a tiny little village in France where the First Division fought its first battle and the first major battle by American troops in World War I. Upon his death in 1955, he left the entire estate as a public park for the people of Illinois, and I and my colleagues that work here are privileged to have custody of that estate now and to be operating it as part of the legacy of Colonel McCormick. Today, of course, we're going to have this symposium on teaching military history, and we are absolutely delighted to have each and every one of you here participating and our webcast participants. Most, if not all of you, are teachers. We think that that is a noble profession, and we are delighted that you're here, and we hope that what we will do over the next day and a half will enrich and empower and stimulate and inspire you to use the materials and ideas that we present to educate a rising generation of citizens. I want to make just a couple of administrative announcements before I turn over to Alan Luxembourg. The first is, I think most of you have already found restrooms and refreshments, but out those doors and to the left are the restrooms. And in the hallway immediately adjacent to us, there will be refreshments throughout the day. You're very welcome to those. This is a participatory seminar. It's not an academic seminar entirely, although we have many distinguished academics here to help us. And so we encourage discussion and question and answer. But when you ask a question or speak, please speak directly into one of the microphones located near your seat so that it can be picked up not only by our PA system but by the webcast. If you don't do that, then we really have a hard time. The other thing is, when you want to be recognized to speak, take your plastic name tent there and turn it up vertically and just leave it there until you're called upon if you have a question or you want to make a comment, and that way the speaker or the moderator will be able to keep track of who wants to enter the discussion. And I think on that note, I'll turn over to Alan, myself, or any of my staff that are wearing the green Cantini T-shirts. We're here to make your stay enjoyable and pleasant, and so please bring any issues or questions to our attention, and we'll do our best to assist you. Welcome to Cantini. Alan?
Hey, I'm Alan Luxembourg, and on behalf of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. To be more specific, I would like to welcome the 35 teachers from 22 states that are with us in this room, but I would also like to welcome the online viewing audience, which is likewise drawn from all parts of the country, but also from Switzerland, Great Britain, Brazil, Singapore, South Africa, and Israel. That's 5 continents. I should explain to our online audience that this webcast will continue for 6 hours, but the conference will actually continue far longer than that. But not to worry. The entire conference is being videotaped, and videos of each session will be posted on our website, fpri.org, and on the website of the First Division Museum, firstdivisionmuseum.org, for free access to all. If you are viewing this webcast online, you may type in questions in the box on your computer screen, which I will receive here in my laptop and relay to the speakers during the Q&A sessions. By way of introduction, I should say that the Foreign Policy Research Institute was founded over 50 years ago by Robert Strauss Hupé on the premise that a nation should think before it acts. As my colleagues are fond of saying, that was a good idea then, and judging by current events, it remains a good idea today. About 20 years ago, we began working with high school teachers in hopes of enriching teachers' understanding of world affairs and of America's role in the world so that teachers could better instruct the next generation of leaders. We consider this an important long-term investment in the future of our country. I could spend a few minutes explaining why we think teaching military history is a subject worth addressing in the classroom, but that is precisely the topic of our first speaker, who can speak about it far more eloquently than I could ever hope to do, so I will leave that job to him. With that, we can now turn to Jeremy Black, a professor of history at Exeter University in Great Britain, a longtime senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and one of the great military historians of our time. He has written so many books that it would be no exaggeration to say that he can write faster than I can read. He also packs a lot into each one of his lectures, so I ask you both to welcome him, but also be prepared to listen very, very carefully. Please welcome Jeremy Black.
Thanks for that. You've got to speed up the reading. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and may I say how pleased I am to be here and how pleased I am to see, in the case of both of our sponsors, the tremendous American tradition of public philanthropy, which has made this country so much richer and in fact helps to make it intellectually so much more central than it would otherwise be. Now, my subject today is why teach military history, and I'm going to aim it specifically at the level of teachers and public education. I am not taking part in an academic seminar. We have a number of very distinguished academics here. I wouldn't wish to get involved in the sort of, historiographical wrangle. What I want to do is to try and explain why we should teach it and how we should teach it. I want to argue that it both can be taught and should be taught. And I'll start off by addressing straight out the usual criticism made against the teaching of military history, that in some way military history encourages bellicosity, in some way that, in other words, it is morally questionable and actually undesirable in the academy at every level. Well, I can answer that, I think, from both the question of personal experience and also from the question of public policy. From the question of personal experience, I live in Britain. I am Jewish. If the Germans had won World War II, I would not be here. And I think one has to bear in mind that war, although undesirable in many of its attributes, although it involves people killing and being willing and being wished to be killed, or ready to be killed rather, not in some cases wishing to be killed. It's rather astonishing if you read some of the diaries of participants in World War I, the kind of suicide cult almost among some of the participants. But anyway, although war involves many horrible attributes, it can in fact serve purposes which we regard as necessary. It can, in fact, serve purposes of civic patriotism, international order that are appropriate. And indeed, Alan drew attention to the present situation. Whatever your views on the present war, and I think it's fair to say that many military historians of right, left and centre are very critical of the present war, nevertheless, nobody doubts, and the United Nations does not doubt, that just war, properly conceived, is an appropriate recourse in international law and in the maintenance of international order. So, it might be nice to pretend that war could be wished away. It cannot be wished away. It has played a major role in the formative experience of individual states, in the formative role of individual societies, and in the formative role of international order. It is therefore an appropriate subject to look at, and that is my essential prelude. Let's, though, switch at once to the question of can it be taught, because it's often the functional issue which is of most importance to teachers. After all, it's all very well of saying something should be taught. Many people would agree that constitutional history should be taught. But you try interesting a 15-year-old in constitutional history of any country, and you will find that that is not an easy task, in fact, well nigh impossible. In the case of military history, it certainly can be taught. The amount of material that survives that one can draw to the attention of students at every age about military affairs, about the conduct of war, about the nature of military institutions, about what the life of war means for individual participants, both soldiers and civilians, is extensive. Indeed, it might be said that war is a more studied topic than just about any other topic available. For example, you not only have in places such as this institution the enormous physical attributes of the material culture of war, which are very extensive, weapons such as the tanks one sees outside, but one can also have, certainly for the last 150 years, extensive photographic archives which can be shown to students. We now have extensive film archives going back, moving picture archives, going back for nearly a century on war. We have very extensive interviews both interviews which are filmed and also interviews which are taped, for pretty well every major state in the world. It is not simply a case of the United States, important as it is, and we're obviously talking in the United States, but for other countries as well. One can look at the most extensive archival material, which can give you a very real sense of what the experience of war meant, so that if you live in a given town, in, shall we say, Connecticut, or a given town in my country, in England, you can actually find archival sources that are available, that are accessible, something that is visual, that is taped, real pictures, real words. It's much more accessible to children often than words on a page. You can find something that is accessible for World War II, for World War I, and for other struggles. I mean, I notice in my own city, Exeter, where I live, which was very heavily bombed in the war with many casualties, a standard exercise that they set the school children at the age of 12 or 13 is to write a diary of what it would have been like to have lived in Exeter during the Blitz. And obviously they then get them to look at sources that survive from that period, of real live accounts of people who were there, and of course it is still possible to meet people from that period and also interview them. And one has a possibility of every source interacting to give the child a much stronger idea of what it means than might have been the case. And of course that living history pattern is also a case in a society like the United States, where you can have, as a supplement to the sources available on tape, the sources available on radio, you can actually go and interview people. And it's quite a good experience for children to actually have the opportunity to meet somebody who is older than them, to sit down and listen to them. It never hurts children to listen to somebody who actually has been through something and can describe it to them. Obviously, it's very difficult to be certain how the child will respond, but on the other hand, they will get the idea that the past is not simply an abstraction on the page or an abstraction on the screen, but actually affects somebody who lived down that road and was actually there 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, which for many children, particularly younger children, is a quite astonishing proposition. So military history can be taught for one's own community and for one's own country. That is relatively easy to do. It's more difficult, more challenging to, of course, look at the other side of the hill. Still a worthwhile exercise. It's an exercise possibly best advanced and offered for students at the upper age of their high school experience. But looking at the other side of the hill means, of course, that if you are, for example, talking about a civil war, you look at both the Confederate and the Union viewpoint of the Civil War, which may sound to you a shocking proposition if you lived in some parts of the South, still to this day. It also means that if you're looking at international conflicts, one tries to understand the experience of war for the other side. Doesn't mean that one sympathises with their viewpoint. There is no necessary reason to introduce any element of moral relativism, but it is useful to understand how war means something different for combatants in other countries. It's useful to understand that both as an intellectual exercise and also, for those of you who might end up going into the military, because it's absolutely crucially important in a functional exercise, because you obviously understand how best to wage war if you understand how your opponents are going to perceive your actions. And a point that's a fairly obvious one is you win a war when you persuade other people to accept your will. You have to consider those factors that are going to lead them to accept or try and deny your will. So understanding other societies is also absolutely crucial to the purpose of military history. And that is both a good functionally and also, as I've said, a good intellectually. It is good for children to have to think about why their society, fighting wars that we can all agree were good wars, World War II, for that matter, World War I was a war against German expansionism and German aggression, and Americans in 1917 were in no doubt about that. But again, it doesn't hurt to sit down and think what the war meant as an experience for the Germans of that period. And of course, we have very good sources, many of them in translation, and there's no point advocating them to students if they're not in translation. We have very good sources in translation. So that again is an aspect of military history that is important. You can teach it as a struggle between combatants in which you can look at both points of view. Another aspect, which again is intellectually valid and interesting to children, and indeed interesting to adults, is the what-if dimension of military history. Now, one of the great problems with history is often taught, often proclaimed, as if it is a clear, linear process in which we know what is going to happen, we know the way that the world was going to be, and in some respects there is therefore an inevitability about it. Well, people at the time were in no sense of inevitability about it. If you think about the people that went out, the Americans that went out in 1917 and 1918, however well they did on the Western Front with their allies, the British and the French, their generals were simply unsure what the consequences would be for them of the collapse of Russia, the communist revolution, Russia leaving the war on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and the Germans being able to move all their divisions from the Eastern Front back to the Western Front. There was uncertainty riven right through the process of war. There always is uncertainty riven right through the process of war. When two powers start a war, generally both sides think they can win, and at least one of them is always wrong. Fundamental point about military history. And understanding that, understanding the conditionality of it, is very important, not just in order to understand wars, but also to understand that history is not a linear process, that the activities of those who take part in war, whether they are civilians on the home front, whether they are the troops themselves at the hard end of war, whether they are their commanders trying to plan options and strategies, that all of those are important because the future is in no way predictable and determined. And that is a very important moral aspect of education that all of us in any scenario, it doesn't have to be military history, it can be civil society as well, all of us are part of a process in which what happens is not determined and in which there is a point taking part in the processes offered. In other words, that a kind of civic democracy, an activity in which one is part of, is part and parcel of framing the present and influencing the future. It is not a determined or overdetermined process. That also is a significant notion intellectually, and it's a significant notion intellectually that we ought to encourage children to think about, and indeed students at university, and indeed other adults. This may seem an obvious point to make in the United States, but it's surprising how even in the United States, which is a democratic society of free enterprise with a very high rate of social mobility, even in the United States, one sees in conversation people offering deterministic viewpoints. That is bound to happen, that sort of argument. Well, actually, what is very unclear is that things are bound to happen. If I might give a simple historical analogy, at the present moment, there is a line that is frequently taken that counterinsurgency struggles are bound to fail. Well, some of them do fail. We can all think of examples that fail. Equally, if you go back to the years since 1945, you can think of counterinsurgency struggles that succeeded. The anti-communists in the Greek Civil War, the suppression of insurgency in the Philippines, the Soviets suppressing opposition in the Baltic states. There have been many insurgencies, the British in Malaya, there have been many insurgencies that have been defeated, just as there have been others that have succeeded. In other words, there is no deterministic viewpoint that tells you that a given stage is bound to happen and another given stage is bound to happen. This is good for students. It's good to introduce their minds to the uncertainty of the past because it helps to get them to think about the uncertainty of the present and the uncertainty of the future, an uncertainty which demands their attention, which suggests that history, the present, politics, the future, is not something one sits back and watches like a spectator, but in which one's own actions, or the choice of oneself not to act, can in fact influence the process in which one is part. So all of that is important. Another good historical analogy which one sees at the present moment is there now are at least two books, for example, writing about a subject which I'm interested in, the American War of Independence, and comparing it to present circumstances. That's an example of where history can be both useful and dangerous. Because one of the interesting things about history is one can pull out analogies from the past that help people to think. It can also be dangerous if the analogies are not carefully thought through. But, having said that, it is important to have some sense of focus on the past in any society, because if one doesn't have any sense of focus on the past for judgment, one has to ask, where do people get their ideas from? Where do people get their ideas from? Now, you might say, well, one responds to every circumstance in the immediate presence. present, by judging one's interests and concerns at that moment. That American policy in 2015 will be set by whatever the American public and political system in 2015 regards as appropriate, and that there is nothing from the past that one needs to conceive of, because the past is in some way dead. History cannot be repeated. And obviously, for example, if you're interested in war, you might argue that, because you might say, well, of course, all the weaponry of the war is as outdated as the mammoth or the catapult. Well, I might just take the general proposition first. We can move to the more detailed proposition in a second. If I might just take the general proposition first. In practical terms, however much societies may believe that they can reject the past, the only way you can reject the past is by a quasi-genocidal destruction of every attribute of it. In modern times, the only society that has sought to completely reject the past is the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, with its attempt to destroy all artifacts from the past, to destroy the educated members of the public, in fact much of the population, to in fact create a thoroughly new society. Another good example of that, I suppose, not quite as brutal, though pretty brutal, were the Jacobins of the French Revolution, who, of course, you may recall, not in their zeal to destroy the past, not only abolished Christianity, but also, for example, abolished the calendar, created a new calendar, a new religion. Everything was that of the present. Well, what we can see in the case of both Cambodia and revolutionary France is it didn't work, and was also astonishingly vicious by any standards. You can be as relativist as you like, but I don't think you could find much to say for either of those regimes. But the general postulate is more important, that people in fact look to the past when they're trying to understand the present. They may not explicitly engage with it, but nevertheless they tend to have a group of common memories that in part frame national identity, a sense of patriotism, or just an idea of experience of looking to the future, looking from the past to the future. So, if you think about it, the way in which people use remarks about issues from the past in order to discuss policy in the present day, they may be flawed, but say the Munich analogy of appeasement of the dictators in 1938 applied it subsequently in other contexts. Again, sometimes the application is a flawed one, but it reflects the sense that there is a possibility, a need to explain things with reference to a common memory, with that common memory unlocking our understanding of what is possible, what is necessary, and what draws people together. Now, in the case of war, this is even more acutely the need, because in war you fundamentally ask people to do what they understandably don't want to do, which is to endure great sacrifices. In the case of soldiers, many soldiers might enjoy fighting, but many of them don't enjoy being separated from their families. They don't enjoy the actual experience of seeing their friends killed or wounded, which is very traumatic for many troops. For civil society, you get the enormous uncertainties of not knowing what is happening to the soldiers at the front, of the dislocation of personal life, of the wrenching of community, etc., etc. We all know about the hardships and horrors that comes with war. And in people thinking about war and people thinking about military preparedness and about the need to actually present themselves adequately and robustly and resiliently in the world, it is therefore important to look to some sense of continuity in order to draw on historical memories that help to make people feel that however difficult this is, that is in some way a necessary purpose. Now, there are different ways you can look at this. All of us can be justifiably deplore the kind of rather crude sort of blood and earth patriotism that was seen in, say, Europe in 1914. It was naive, it was foolish, it was atavistic. We don't necessarily disagree with that. But on the other hand, we also need to understand that the nature of civic patriotism in any country is that in order to exist in a community, you have to have some sense of a willingness to give up things for the greater whole. Now, ordinarily, all we are asked to give up is taxation. Ordinarily, all we're asked to give up is the civility of accepting that somebody else has a right to stand in the pavement where you want, or the sidewalk where you might want to stand, or that you might not be able to run a red light however much you're in a hurry because it might involve damaging somebody else, let alone actually get into trouble for it. Ordinarily, social civility, social order, membership of the community does not involve terrible constraints upon people, however much they might find them inconvenient or upsetting. But of course, military confrontation and war is very different. Now, some societies have the luxury, in part of their debate, of believing that they can opt out of war. I'll discuss that in a second. But if you were to look around the world and address the question, why teach military history? One of the major reasons to be aware of why people teach military history is that many societies have no such option. They know that if things go wrong, they will be in a dire position. One of the countries I visited this summer was Estonia. Estonia, bordering Russia, it feels very vulnerable at the present moment. And if you talk to Estonians and walk around and look at their newspapers, which is not easy to do because the language is incredibly difficult, but if you do that in Estonia, you will be aware that the sense of a national past in which they were incorporated very bloodily into Russian rule under Peter the Great. They then got free of Russian rule at the end of World War I. They were then incorporated again, conquered in 1940, with large numbers of Estonians taken off to the gulags. They were then obviously conquered by the Germans. A lot of other people got killed by the Germans. They were then conquered by the Soviets again in 1944. Again, a lot of people getting taken off to the gulags. In the case of Estonia, you don't really have a luxury of deciding whether military history should or shouldn't be taught. Quite frankly, it's central to the nation's history. You cannot understand the experience, the uncertainties of their politics without understanding the difficult context in which they are. And of course, this civic patriotism resonates in those countries which still has military service, often as an explicit means of warning its citizens about the dangers of the context in which they might be. Now, we might obviously feel that sometimes this is over-egged. I don't believe anybody really feels that Switzerland is about to be invaded. But nevertheless, there are many countries, many societies in the world that are in a parlous and vulnerable situation. And the issue of why to teach military history in these societies is entirely appropriate. And for us in Britain or America, feeling to a certain extent, not quite as in the front line, possibly in the terms of an international war, whatever we might feel in terms of terrorism, nobody, however badly we do in a war, we are unlikely to, however badly, for example, the Americans did in the Vietnam War, Viet Cong troops were not going to pour across the beaches at Santa Monica or Santa Cruz or Santa Barbara to upset the locals and affect their views on how nice the Viet Cong were. So that however much one might do badly at a war, we are not in the front line in that sense, but we have to be aware there are other societies that are in the front line and that they need to think very carefully and that they need to explain to their public very carefully what is the consequences of doing badly and what happens if you do find the worst situation happening. Now, all of this is all very well, but what kind of military history then does one teach? What is appropriate? What can one offer to a 15-year-old or a 17-year-old, or students I teach, 18 or 19-year-olds? Well, again, military history, one of the attraction of it, one of the reasons why it is worth teaching, is it actually covers and encompasses a wide range of subjects, or if you wish to call them this, sub-subjects. There is, on the one hand, what tends to be understood as military history if you switch on the History Channel, for operational history, the doings and campaigns of battles, of military formations, air, sea and land, the way in which they beat their opponents, the experience of war. That is probably what most people would understand as military history. And as I've already indicated, it can be taught. Military history, of course, is more than that. It's not in any way lessening that to note that there are other branches of military history as well. There is the relationship between war and the development of states. That is absolutely crucial. It's through war that states developed. We are standing in the United States. The United States bears the origins it has because it arose as a result of a successful war of independence. If it hadn't had a successful war of independence against the evil Brits, you would have probably ended up like Canadians or Australians. And that may or may not be a good or a bad thing, depending upon your point of view. But it would have been different. It would have been different. Through war, again, the United States expanded from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Conflict with Native Americans, war with the Mexicans, the occupation of Florida. There are a whole series of conflicts. American history, the development of the American state, and finally, and most obviously traumatically, civil war between Americans themselves, the history of America would have been totally different without war. And to teach the development of the American state without registering that is absurd. Absolutely absurd. I noticed not so long ago an encyclopedia of the American Revolution, an enormous one of over 500 pages, in which actually fewer than 30 pages were devoted to the war. Every other aspect conceivable about society in those years were covered, but not the war. Well, that would have been absurd. It would have surprised George Washington. It wouldn't have captured the experience of people at the time, which was that the war pressed on and affected their entire life in every way, not just the experience of combat, and obviously dealing with the after effects of combat, but also the need to pay for it, the need to consider how best to supply their forces, etc., etc. So, war and state development is a major aspect of military history. War and the international order is a major aspect of military history. It is through war that the relationships between states have been moulded and influenced. States that tend to do well economically then tend to demand a role and place in the international order which accords with their views, and until very recently they have pursued this through violence, and it is entirely possible that at least military preparedness would play a role in how they pursue it in the future. We have here a very distinguished scholar who's argued on the obsolescence of war. It may well be true that at the level of great powers nobody wishes to engage in a nuclear conflict, but it is equally possible that military confrontation short of war will be an important aspect of the military history of the future, and we need to understand what can be achieved and what will not be achieved through such processes. Another aspect, of course, which is very broad brush, is what is known as war and society, what used to be termed the new military history. Now, war and society covers an enormous range of topics. It covers, for example, the experience of women in war. It covers war and environment. It covers a whole host of what, to some critics, fairly or unfairly, are regarded as politically correct opposites. In fact, they're entirely reasonable to talk about them, because insofar as war is in part a matter of civil society and how it responds and engages, it's entirely appropriate to talk about it. Also, another aspect of war and society that needs to be considered is the military itself as a society. If you think of, for example, the First Division, the world it came from in 1917, 1918, you're talking about very large numbers of men taken away, or volunteering, in some societies, conscription of course, to leave their home communities and going to form a new social order in which you had to rapidly introduce ways of behaviour which actually fulfilled the tasks of the military, but that also left out the whole way in which men, and these days men and women, interact in situations of military preparedness and sometimes in situations of the extremities of conflict. All of those are an important aspect of war and society, and in order to understand military effectiveness you have to understand how armies work as societies, what hierarchy, deference, order, independence and autonomy means in a military context. And of course armies engage explicitly with this. One of the ways in which the American army tries to outperform its opponents is not just investing in expensive equipment, but also, for example, encouraging very junior officers to take the ability to make decisions and combat decisions without having to refer them always up the command hierarchy, whereas of course many societies which are much more rigid and authoritarian won't take a decision because they're worried about what will happen unless it's taken far higher up the hierarchy of control and command. So war and society is an important element, and again it's an element that is worth thinking about, because the point that sometimes I'm asked about, well, how do you interest children in military history when a lot of children, just over half in my country, of the population at school age are women, girls. They're not necessarily particularly interested. At university level, that's less of a problem. I can tell you my sign-up rates are about 50-50 in gender terms. But it is no doubt at all, if you look at high schools, that it is much more interesting for many girls to be taught about the war and society in the home front dimension than it is about the combat zone if they can't identify with any figure in the combat zone. So that is an element that needs to be thought about, but the very fact that military history encompasses war in society means that one can address that issue. Now, in covering all these categories, of course, I've made it sound like a universal gatherum, military history. And in practical terms, it is, because we could go even further. We could talk, for example, about war and culture. War has had an enormously important impact on culture in terms of the fact that until very recently the triumphant display of power through conflict was a major theme of cultural productivity, as was the horrors of war and criticism of war on the grounds of those horrors. Both cultural themes can be seen in art, both cultural themes can be seen in music, and each of those are accessible to students. So if you are dealing with upper-level students at high school level who are interested in culture, you can actually juxtapose to them images, photographs of, as it were, what you might call the triumphalist account of the culture of war and what you might call the critical account. If you wanted to do music, you could play, say, Beethoven's Wellington's Victory, which is an astonishing piece of music which the Austrian composer Beethoven wrote to commemorate the Duke of Wellington's victory at the Battle of Vittoria over the French, in which you hear the British national anthem getting steadily louder, the French national anthem getting steadily louder, an enormous clash of arms, and then the British national anthem back again. It's actually not a bad piece of music, but its actual theme is fairly crude. And it's certainly very dramatic for children, very dramatic for adults as well. It's like Tchaikovsky's 1812 piece, but a bit longer. Now, you can juxtapose that, and you can obviously juxtapose 20th century pieces of music which are far more about the dissonance of war. Same with art. Most 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, you show them a picture of Picasso's Guernica, you put next to that an account from the newspapers of the period, let's say Steer's account in the Times of the bombing of Guernica, you then put down next to that some German propaganda piece saying that Guernica was never bombed, and it actually makes for quite an interesting lesson in how you explain what happens, how war itself is open to different accounts, and how those different accounts are sometimes heavily propagandist, and how one encodes and tries to understand what is going on. The fact that you have such an enormous variety of sources is tremendously valuable, because for much of types of history that you might try and teach, you do not have such a wonderful set of sources that you can show to the children. Last, before I take some questions, is one moves into much more resolutely looking at the experience of the last 50 years, last 50, 60 years. In these cases, pretty well across the world, there are some wars, of course, of which the records are relatively dim, very limited. The war in which the largest number of people got killed in the last 15 years, the Congo War, the war in which over 5 million people got killed, we actually have very few reliable sources and very little by way of good film material that you could show children, or you would necessarily want to show children in case of some of the horrors that are on offer. But if you go back and you think, for example, about the conflicts of the last 50 years, one has a situation in which the material on offer is so great that teachers can select what seems to them appropriate and pertinent in terms of giving lessons to the pupils in which they are encouraged to understand the experience of war, B, the purpose of war. And you can take different views on that. You will take different views on that. But the key thing is to try and encourage the students to express and articulate their views. And C, the fact that war means different things around the world. It's tremendously valuable for people in Britain or the United States to understand that most war in the world is actually not a matter of Western powers, and most war in the world is very different. Much of the war in the world is in South Asia, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that it is often an aspect of conflict which responds to and reflects natures of those societies which students need to be taught to about. They need to understand what tribalism means, what ethnic conflict means. All of these are concepts which it is important that they understand if they are to understand the world in which they are living. And that is a significant way in which military history is valuable, because in looking at recent war, whatever particular view you take of the rights or merits of individual conflicts, in looking at recent war, you're helping to unlock students to understand that the world in which they are living involves complex issues, that these complex issues are divisive, that the divisions involve enormous sacrifices on the part of many of the people involved, and that these pose real questions for the United States, as for other powers, as to how to respond, how appropriately to respond, and whether a response will be successful or not. So in aspect and in conclusion, war and teaching military history is a key element of civic education. And civic education is an important dimension of society. I would argue that civic education is a key element of patriotism. It is encouraging people to understand their own country in the context of a world in which they have their own values, their own country is important and appropriate and central in those values, but also their own country is not in isolation. It interacts with others, and sometimes that interaction involves conflict, and sometimes it involves not conflict, but one nevertheless understands better one's own society through looking at others. So civic patriotism, to me, is a key element. And I would say that that is an element that really we need to think about. People often treat patriotism as a sort of dirty word. They're often embarrassed or inconvenienced by what happens by governments operating in their name. And of course, an aspect of legitimate civil politics is all of us understand the legitimacy of opposition as well as government, the right and value of dissent as well as support for government. Nobody, when one uses the term patriotism, is asking for connivance, complicity or support in an authoritarian regime. What one is asking for is an ability within a civic society to encourage a mature debate in which, as part of that mature debate, you realise that sometimes people are asked to risk their lives for the services of others, for the rights of that society to operate as it thinks appropriate, and that is something that one needs to understand and not necessarily to be regarded as something that one pushes under the carpet, as something that has in some way a nasty smell. So in other words, civic patriotism is a key element of military history. It's a key element that draws on the nature of our societies, on the way in which in our societies we need to incorporate different groups and to encourage them to think in patriotic terms. And also, it is something that can be taught. And lastly, and my final point, which is one that we all need to think about, is on the whole, students find military history interesting. On the whole, so do adults. You go to a bookshop at an airport or a high street mall, and you will find that the section on history that is most frequently there, far more than, for example, religious history. America may be a very religious society. People don't want to read about religious history. What they are interested in is much more on military history, on the Civil War, World War II in particular. And in education, it always seems to me that we have, in a certain extent, to work with the grain. If students are keen or interested in going in a certain direction, we have to build on that, direct it, encourage it, ask them difficult questions, get them to ask difficult questions of themselves. And that is much better and much easier to do than if we propose to them the absolute vital need to understand another part of history, as I mentioned earlier, let us say constitutional history, and they have simply no interest in it whatsoever. I could have given you a lecture on the merits of constitutional history as understanding civic patriotism, and you might have listened politely, but in the end of the day you would have known your students wouldn't have been interested. So what I'm trying to do is not only offer what I think is appropriate and necessary, but also offer what is prudential and possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. We're now open for questions, both from our audience here in the room as well as from the online audience. If you're in the room, we just ask you to turn up your 10 card so we can see you. And if you're viewing this online, just type in your question in the box on your computer screen. I'll get things going by taking two questions. There are two different versions of the same question from Stuart Hines and Harry Richland. Basically, as you pointed out, there is a voracious appetite for military history among the general public, evidenced by History Channel, popular books, and so forth. But yet, military history seems to be looked down upon in academia and in schools. Why is there a disjunction between what the general public is interested in and what the academic sector is interested in?
That's a very vexed issue, and there has been a certain amount of discussion about it. As far as universities are concerned in the United States, I think in part it reflects a sense of disquiet, a sort of belief that in some way if you're teaching about military history, you're encouraging vicious behaviour, that you're encouraging bellicosity. I think that's a misunderstanding. I think it's very interesting to note, for instance, that if you took the recent war, it began in 2003, the majority of military historians, most of whom are politically on the right, actually opposed the war. You know, if you look at, for example, in Britain, you had the most famous military historian, Sir Michael Howard, saying this is going to be a disastrous mistake. So it isn't necessarily on the grounds of prudence, on the grounds this isn't going to work, not whether they wanted it to or not. You know. So I think it's mistaken to believe, because in fact, if you study war, you know about uncertainty, you know about risk, and you know that things are not necessarily going to work out. So that encourages you to be cautious. Doesn't mean you don't think there are things worth fighting about. I used the example of World War II advisedly. There have been wars since then that it was necessary to fight. If the Americans mostly, but others as well, hadn't fought, then South Korea would now be part of a tyranny run by North Korea. And I don't think that that is a particularly desirable environment, whatever you might think about the North Korean government. So I think there have been wars that it is very necessary to have fought. But equally, military historians do not go around saying this is all going to be easy. So I think that there is that people are mistaken, but that is the point. And I suppose in the terms of America's culture wars, it is also the case that many of the people who as young students were engaged politically in opposition to the Vietnam War have subsequently risen to positions of power and have been in a position to establish curricula and and programs like that. So I think in part this is an issue of America's culture wars rather than anything that is necessary. And I suspect that from the outside world, you would find many people consider it quite bizarre that the world's most prominent military power, a state that for good or ill is the key power in the world, which can use the threat of its force or just its military presence to influence the policies of others, that it should choose not to or should not understand or should not debate its military history is bizarre. I was recently giving a lecture on to an American audience on war in the modern day, and a female student from Uzbekistan said, well, you know, it would be good if America was more robust, more resilient in trying to intervene, because, you know, in my country we live under a tyranny, and, you know, so I think one has to understand that to the rest of the world it's rather peculiar that the Americans, having the great power, are in some respects reluctant to discuss what can and cannot be achieved through the use of force.
Okay, we have a question there from Joshua Totten Greenwood from Nashua South High School in New Hampshire.
Absolutely. I was actually curious if you could talk for a moment on the role of Hollywood in history, because I think you're exactly right. The kids are excited about military history. The first day, I say, hey guys, you're here to learn the sexy part of history. I mean, this is it right here. But how do we combat the misinformation that they're given?
Yes.
For example, you know, the movies and whatnot, they're not on the right page. You know? Yep. They're excited, but they're just not.
Well, that's an excellent question, Joshua. And some movies are terribly, if you're a Brit, for example, The Patriot is an account of the American War. The Patriot's very interesting, made by a German director, showing British troops pushing people into a church and setting fire to them, which the British never did, nor for that matter to their opponents did, but which really did happen in World War II and was done by Germans. It's a very interesting transfer, but there are several things to be said. First, even within Hollywood, one can see different products. I mean, the two Clint Eastwood films recently about Okinawa, which I thought very, very, very interesting. Very good films, engaging explicitly with the issue of patriotism on both sides, engaging explicitly with the nature of comradeship, which is a key military experience. I thought they were very good films. Secondly, if one can't do that in the Hollywood context, one can take films from different societies. For example, if you take the submarine war in the North Atlantic during World War II, there are both good German films about the experience of being submariners, although incidentally none of them ever mention the fact that the German submarine force had a very, very high rate of membership of the Nazi Party and that its head, Admiral Dönitz, was a fanatical Nazi. They don't tend to mention that, but nevertheless, they give you a sense of what the experience was like being in a submarine, in a crowded, hot environment, and what depth charges sounding to the distance were like. I think they capture that very well. And on the other hand, you have British and American films giving the British and American viewpoint. So you can offer it to students. Most of the good non-Western films have been dubbed, or in other words translated. So in other words, a film like De Bots, the famous German submarine one, you can show the children or sort of students in an English version. That is not an issue. But I think you're right. Hollywood has an enormously effective grasp on the imagination, but on the other hand, Hollywood is more diverse than there's a left-of-centre dominance at the moment. There was a right-of-centre dominance in the 30s. Even during those periods, whatever you could point to films that were made that didn't fit in or correspond to the orthodoxy. So one can see a variety of views of what the experience of war is offered and the purposes of war is. Sorry, there's a Drew over there, I think it is.
Drew Gibson?
Yes, a pedagogical question here about teaching military history in the context of the general survey course. And just would like to hear your comment on whether it's more effective to just add one more strand, like economic history, social history, military history strand as you're going along, or to just spend more time going into depth about a particular operational campaign, things like that, the pros and cons of the two approaches.
Well, I think that very much depends upon your view of the particular school population that you are dealing with. If the trouble is, if you deal with it as a completely separate strand, is you're suggesting that in some way it can be abstracted from the process. And what I was saying with, for example, looking at war and state development and war and society, is actually that military history in its widest sense is part and parcel of the entire deal. So if you took America in the 1940s, it is part and parcel of it, both the military history, yes, what happened, but also, for example, the expansion of the power of the federal government, the development of Washington, the moves towards desegregation under Truman after the war, are all as much part of civil society as they are part of military society. And that I think is quite important, that you can't separate it out. People today love the idea. I have two children. I don't want either of them to get killed in a war. We all love the idea that in some way we can abstract war from the experience of civil society, and in some way we can separate it. I would actually say it's much more part of the mainstream, either war or the possibility of war, or what military life can tell you about strains and tensions in the rest of society and aspects in the rest of society. For example, when war doesn't happen is very, very important. It's probably one of the most important aspects of American history is that since the late 19th century, there have been very few episodes in which American regular troops have come. I'm not talking about the National Guard. American regular troops have been used in civil society. One can think of the use of the airborne at Little Rock, for example, to support desegregation. But you see, this is an enormously important aspect of American history, whereas if you contrast it to other major states, including democracies like India or Indonesia or my country, Britain, the use of troops in civil order environments against regional separatists, against strikers, has all been quite important. So an aspect of military history which helps to make it central is when, in fact, the military isn't used as much as when it is used.
Okay, we have a few questions. We'll go to P.J. Chagan from the American Academy in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, I think.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm interested in the question of, can you think of effective examples when there have been people, I'm thinking of political figures primarily, who have used history effectively in shaping public opinion regarding whether to proceed with war or not? Are there any examples of someone who has effectively used history in helping the public to conceive of their past as helping to shape future decisions?
That's a fascinating question which requires a lot of thought both ways. Let's think straight off the use that the British put, and Churchill explicitly put in World War II, of the past conflict with Napoleon. And, you know, the way in which they, first of all, brought out all sorts of cultural things from the past, the famous film of, you know, going right the way back, of Henry V, you know, there was the wartime performance with Olivier, which a lot of money was put behind. The books, Sir Arthur Bryant was made to write all these wretchedly boring books, but very patriotic books about the wars against the... The fact is they were talking about fighting the French whilst they were actually fighting the Germans. But this idea of the country back to the wall, all the rest of it. Hitler, incidentally, did exactly the same thing, or rather Goebbels did. If you look at German filmmaking during World War II, they made a number of films about Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, of course, fought the Russians, and the most famous of those films is a film called Kohlberg, which came out at the beginning of 1945. And what Kohlberg is about is it was a famous siege in the latter stage of the war, the Seven Years' War, in which the Russians besieged this position in Prussia, and in the end the Prussians were successful because there was a miraculous change in Russian policy. Basically, the Tsarina died and a new Tsar came in. But the point is that Prussia was saved. Now, interestingly enough, because there's been quite a lot of work done on Nazi use of film, what happened in the early stages of the war is people seemed, and we've got Goebbels' diaries, is actually people seemed to have been relatively happy with the propaganda films that were pumped out. Goebbels spent vast sums of money on it. But by 1944, the audiences were reported by the Gestapo as being unhappy, dissatisfied, not convinced. I mean, Goebbels goes on doing it, of course. But the use of history has always been seen as important for both good and ill. Both good and ill. It's very rare that a government does not choose to refer to the past, which is one of the important reasons to encourage in the public. I mean, I've always thought that one of the things that historians should really encourage in the public is what is necessary in democracy, which is humane skepticism. I'm not talking about cynicism. Cynicism is a bad thing. There's too much cynicism. There's too much negativity. That's bad. But humane skepticism, understanding that you need to think through the situation, and then when it is appropriate to make a major effort and to try and achieve things, as the United States did do and has done and will do in the future, but also in other scenarios to understand that something possibly is inappropriate, and through what we legitimate in our political system, which is we legitimate constitutional and peaceful opposition, to encourage people to advance different propositions in opposition. And obviously, at the present moment, you have one government in and another government in opposition, another party in opposition, but you know, these parties may well change places. These views should be of equal interest to Republicans and Democrats in the United States.
Okay, we have a question from Mark Yanaway at Wamogo High School in Connecticut.
Would it be disingenuous to say that democracy itself is a result of war, and the advance of technology, if we look at the Greeks with the transition from bronze to iron and the expansion of the Hoplite army, later the institution of the Levée en masse in France, etc.?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I see shades of Victor Davis Hanson in there. Not that there's anything wrong necessarily with shades of Victor Davis Hanson. I certainly think that a willingness to fight for liberty and freedom has been crucial to the development of democracies. Yes, no two ways about that. That does not mean that necessarily a willingness to fight for liberty and freedom has been successful. I mean, if, for example, you were an American and you were looking around the world in 1795, you might be very worried, because you would have seen your republic succeed, but you would have seen Republican attempts fail in Holland in 1787, in Poland in 1795, and you would actually think, gosh, maybe it's, you know, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, which is, in a sense, was the Federalist line. You know, we've got to organize our state and, you know, leave aside these agrarian fantasies of Mr. Jefferson. We need to be robust and develop a national army, a national navy, and a national bank, and be robust. So, yes, in many senses, democracies have only emerged because people have been willing to fight for them, but that doesn't mean that the willingness to fight necessarily will achieve the goals. The same thing with technology. It is always a good thing for soldiers to have confidence in their weaponry, and it is always therefore important for them to feel that they have the best weapons. But having the best weapons does not necessarily secure victory. There are a whole host of other factors involved in victory in combat, to do with unit cohesion, morale, appropriate command structures, sensible command decisions, all sorts of things. There are also all sorts of decisions at the, as it were, a supra-combat level. So technology can be incredibly important, but it also gets you into trouble. I mean, let me give you an example of this. The British in the 1830s were then probably at the cutting edge of the world in technology, the power that had invented the Industrial Revolution, etc., etc., etc. They invade another country, and of course, as you will know, because the Afghans had unfortunately not read Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers and didn't know that they were bound to lose, or preordained to lose, only one British soldier gets out. Or if you've read the Flashman novels, you will know Sir Harry Flashman gets out as well. I mean, technology can be, it's something, I've written quite a lot about technology and war, and Professor Van Creveld has written a lot, very, very eloquently, a whole book on the subject. It can be an enormous enabler. It can be enormously influential in power projection, in logistics, in communications, in getting your troops to from place A to place B. But once you are there, it doesn't necessarily achieve your purposes. And if I could add one more refinement, technology works much better on the sea and in the air, which are not environments in which human beings naturally operate, than it does on land. And so partly it depends upon which arm of war you are looking at. It would be bizarre not to write a history of the sea, of navies or of air forces, which isn't technology focused. But if you were to write a history of infantry combat, which simply focused on technology, I'm sure veterans of this division will tell you that it was absolutely crucial. In many senses, they didn't have the best weapons. In many senses, the German weapons in both, not just Tiger tanks and things, but also small arms, were actually better in 1944, 1945. In many senses, German tactical training was better in 1918. But there were crucial elements in terms of obviously the morale of the troops, the unit cohesion, the training. All of these play an enormous role in helping, units like this to have done extraordinarily well in World War I and World War II, and indeed will do so in the future. And most, after all, of peacetime army activity, including when you're actually at war but you're not in the front line, is involved in training. And they train because it is important to know how to fight. And, if we were to take 10,000 Montana militiamen of an extreme political disposition and put them up against 3,000 regulars of the American army, even if they were armed with exactly the same technology, probably you could buy better guns in Walmart than the American government, even if they were armed in exactly the same technology, nevertheless the American military would beat them because it is better trained and more, has better understanding of how to operate in difficult circumstances. So guns themselves, that kind of boys and toys and kit doesn't necessarily explain things.
Okay, a question from Richard Bruno at Rocky Hill High School, also in Connecticut.
I wanted to go back to the question of academia and the attitude towards the study of war. I'm not sure the problem is so much that war isn't studied, but it seems to me that self-criticism, which I think is part of the genius of the West that we could also trace back to the Greeks, has turned to not only to cynicism but almost to self-hatred, where the West, the United States, is blamed for virtually every problem in the world and usually attended to the military. But in addition to that, war, when it is studied, has been shriveled down to sort of the multicultural trinity of race, gender, and class. And the Organization of American Historians, for example, in their annual program have a lot of offerings on war, but none that go past those three categories of race, gender, and class.
Well, that's again this is, as you know, highly controversial as a subject, and as you probably are aware, people are very divided on this issue as to what is going on in the United States and its teaching of military history at the present moment. I'll just make one or two reflections. First, what is going on in the United States is not necessarily an apt description of what goes on elsewhere. So that in my country, for example, we have quite a lot of teaching of military history, and I don't face any, I teach 3 courses on it. I have to leave early because I have to teach 2 of them on Monday morning. I don't face any problems from my colleagues on that count. So I think it is a specifically American problem, which I think is the first issue to deal with. Second, clearly, there is problems in terms of a hostility to the teaching of military history. Yes. Those problems largely pertain to actually closing it down as a subject rather than to affecting what is happening when it is taught. In a sense, if the most striking thing is that university after university, particularly the Ivy Leagues, the University of California system, do not teach much military history. It's not that the military history that they teach is what you might find odd. It's that they don't actually often teach very much military history. And we can look at that in 2 different ways. Number 1, favourable. Number 2, unfavourable. Let's take the favourable strategy first. What is actually happening is that the entire subject of history has to a degree been changed since the 1960s. It's not just military history that has been put into decline, so has constitutional history, legal history, diplomatic history, high political history. So in part, what you're talking about is not something specifically necessarily aimed at military historians. Constitutional and legal historians are even worse state. Okay? So that's part of a shift in the nature of higher education in the United States towards a different kind of social history. I myself am not very happy with that shift. I suspect I share your views on the matter, but one has to put it in this wider context rather than simply thinking of military history. The second point is a less favourable one. It is that, in a way, we've built up a situation in which there was a major reaction against teaching it in the 60s and 70s. That meant that good graduate students frequently didn't do the subject. That meant that when you moved through 20 years down the line and you were looking for senior appointments, you didn't have the same pool of talent. Furthermore, a lot of the publishing houses weren't publishing military history, so if you have the choice of appointing to a senior post somebody with a couple of books from Princeton or somebody with a couple of books from, shall we say, a lesser press, then you know that often the academics will go for one rather than the latter. So yes, in some cases, I think there is absolutely no doubt. There is institutional and personal bias, and you're quite right to regard it as reprehensible. Other aspects you're talking about is much more the complex nature of ways in which cultures operate, in this sense an academic culture, which may be specifically designed against military history, but is actually much more a broader issue and a broader problem. But I suspect I sympathise much more with you than that answer suggests.
Okay, I see we have a question on this side of the room, but can you identify yourself, because I can't see the...
Oh, Barbara, my name is Barbara Blakesley, Palm Springs Middle School, Florida. My question relates to 3 sets of comments that you made which were interrelated. First, I was really struck by your comments about patriotism. It's so often used as a dirty word. Now, I know all of our textbooks do have a point of view, and I teach that to my students, but a lot of my colleagues will dismiss a whole textbook and say, well, that's nothing but blatant patriotism, as if it's the vilest insult. And then your comments on propaganda, because the last thing I would want to do would be to be a propagandist. So partly I'm asking, how do you distinguish between patriotism and propaganda? And then the third string that this tied in with was your comment that it's not always the weapons that make a difference. Often it's the inner sense of a people, their sense of mission, of commitment, of who they are and what they stand for. So there is such a need to bring this together, and I'll say as a personal reflection, now that students know they don't have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, almost none of them do. It's almost like a badge of pride to not stand for the pledge, and many of my students have families in the military but will not stand for the pledge. So how do we teach this without becoming propagandists?
Right, that's again a very fascinating question. Can I take the first one initially? Patriotism and nationalism. The practical way to deal with critics of patriotism and nationalism is to argue, is to say to them, you disapprove of what I am saying, you actually are offering a different form of patriotism and nationalism. I mean, this is actually very, very important. I mean, I, for example, am a supporter of the British Conservative Party. We are in opposition at the present moment, and we offer different policies to those of the government. That doesn't mean that I think that the government is unpatriotic or, or is opposed to nationalism, although I'm worried about its views on European integration. It means that I accept that there is more than one way to define patriotism and nationalism. I think that's a very important point, which critics of it within the United States have lost sight of. They preferred the rather soft option of just being rude, rather than actually the difficult option, which is to say, fine, you have a different point of view, define the notion of the national interest in accordance with your concept of patriotism, which is, in a sense, what ought to happen. In a sense, it does happen in a sort of slightly apologetic fashion in general elections, in your presidential elections, but it isn't really defined sufficiently because, as you correctly say, people are uncomfortable with being called patriotic, which is an absurdity. It's an absurdity if you live in a civil society to be uncomfortable with the notion of patriotism. And indeed, in many senses, it is more important with a society which has high rates of diversity, which is true of the United States, increasingly true of the countries of Europe. It is more important in countries with high rates of diversity that they can actually encourage a sense of patriotism while accepting that different people will interpret patriotism in divergent ways. In other words, patriotism is compatible with democracy. We're not talking about a 19th century patriotism where you're either patriotic or you're in some way a traitor. We're talking about a kind of patriotism in which it is compatible with democratic notions. Okay? That's point one. Last point. I really can't say anything on the Pledge of Allegiance because we don't have that concept, so I really can't. I mean, I'm not saying we're right, but we just don't have it. So I was reading a book recently, actually, in which apparently Indian school children have to do that every day, and it works in India, which is interesting, with India being the largest democracy in the world, and having a very enormous diversity there, both religious and ethnic. The third point, yes, I mean, it is the case that what one might conceive of as popular warfare and the popular struggle can play an enormous role. And I think a good example of that actually occurs in World War II. In World War II, logically, if you think about it, the Germans and the Japanese ought to have enjoyed much, much more support. In the case of the Germans operating in Eastern Europe, they were able to draw on, or should have been able to draw on, the powerful anti-communism of those societies. In the case of the Japanese, they should have been able to draw on the powerful rejection of colonialization and anti-imperialism in societies such as Malaya and Burma and Java and so on. Instead of which, as a result of their vicious policies, their expropriatory ideologies, their notion that other people were part of some chain of being in which everybody else was down the bottom and they were up at the top, meant that they completely squandered the opportunities of creating what might otherwise have been truly disastrous opponents, truly terrifying opponents. And I think that's a very interesting indication that the Germans in particular, because they underrated the popular will, the capacity of societies that they were up against to operate effectively. They were convinced that Eastern European societies were Slavic or vitiated by communism, weakened by Judaism. They were convinced that Western societies, such as the United States and Britain, were vitiated by consumerism and democracy and individualism. Therefore, they assumed there would be no role in these societies for the popular will, that they were run by weak elites which would collapse easily, and degenerate people and would collapse easily. Well, they got it wrong. And I think misjudging the capacity of the popular will in one's opponents can be a very, very serious problem. And it particularly comes with people that are fascinated with the idea that they can win through battle and don't think sufficiently about the wider dimension of winning a war.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.